Yeah, so let me begin by thanking Srini, Mahendra, Luca, and of course, my good friend and colleague, Loganayagam, for this invitation. We've sort of, heard some of these words. So the reason, Rahul, there was no title was it was sort of, trying to relate to things that have been sort of discussed, and I'll try to make an argument around it. So I'll essentially talk about scaling universality. And if you notice, I use the word spottiness in homage to Batchelor and Townsend's early observations in 1949. I'll speak a little bit about, intermittency in this context. So, all right. So in this talk, I'll again sort of underline what Srini mentioned about the ubiquity of turbulence, and I'll try to see if I can sort of gather it all together in the end. I'll try my best. So on one hand, we of course have, what we are more familiar with, high Reynolds number flows. So that's sort of non-living systems, if you like. So that's at Reynolds going to infinity, classical turbulence. This is a nice sort of movie from the Johns Hopkins database, taken from this paper by PK, Diego, and Srini, which sort of tells you a little bit about how these flows look. However, just to underline the ubiquity, you can also see somewhat similar features when you look at things in the Reynolds going to zero limit. So this is a low Reynolds number flow, and this is a this is a movie from some experiments that is ongoing at NCBS, which is essentially a suspension, equalized suspension filmed with good microscopes in a Posse 2D setup. So what I'm going to tell you a little bit about is sort of go back and forth between these two pictures that we have and try and understand scaling universality, which will be in the context of this system. It's sort of well known, one hopes, in the context of high Reynolds number flow, and try to sort of think about the spottiness in the picture that you have there. So, so let's begin with the question of universality and scale invariance. So in this talk, I won't go through a big sort of introduction, but in this talk, essentially the system, just to have a physical system in mind, what we are going to talk about are dense suspensions of these sort of creatures which move. Essentially, the experiments, I'm actually not going to talk about our experimental results, but that's just to sort of fix some ideas because this is a kind of diverse audience. So the early sort of experiments were on this system, which I'll mention, which you find in these sort of references, and the stuff that we are sort of doing is in the E. coli bacteria. So one of the interesting things which was sort of noted in this paper about 10 years ago is that when you take a dense suspension of these guys, they flow, of course, because they're motile objects, they move, but they move at very low speeds, and you have the numbers there for those of you who are interested. And essentially, these are sort of low Reynolds number flows. And when and so again from the same paper, when you actually sort of take the experimental images and then try to sort of image them using the standard processing tools, you get pictures which are strongly reminiscent of what you find in real 2D high Reynolds number turbulence. So that's from what you would, for example, find in soap films and Prasad's here. So you see a lot of them in Prasad's thesis many years ago. So all of this sort of gave rise to this field in some sense, which is this sort of formal or informal similarity between the pictures that you see up there, gave rise to this sort of field of active turbulence, as it were, and so essentially, whether these sort of systems, how similar they are to the system that you see from Guido's review paper. All right, so how does one begin to model such suspensions? There's a microscopic approach, which I will not go through at all, which has to do with, agent-based systems. So you take discrete particles, you sort of try and make them more and more realistic as you go along, how they interact, etc. There's a sort of bunch of very important and interesting papers that you can look at. What we take is a more macroscopic approach, which is sort of the one that I'm more familiar with, is that when you start looking at these suspensions as a fluid, you can sort of start to think about it as a coarse-grained sort of fluid description. So for those of you who know the field, what follows will be in the class of what's known as dry active matter. And essentially what people wrote down many years ago, and so these are all the sort of nice references where you'll find this, is that this sort of, these bacterial suspensions can be treated as some sort of a continuum to the fluid, which obeys certain hydrodynamic equations. And all that we are going to look at in this talk is what happens as you keep changing alpha. Alpha comes with a negative sign, so it's some sort of an injection in the system. And the question that naturally arises from someone like me with a background in classical turbulence is to ask the question that in what sense are these low Reynolds number flows turbulent? And the question that I won't have time to sort of discuss in any length is how is this emergent flow beneficial to the bacterium itself? So yeah. So the bacterial suspension, and we then shine light on it. The experimental movie, you mean, right? Yeah. Okay. So this sort of two questions are essentially answered by people in our group. So Siddhartha was a postdoc who's sort of joining as a faculty member at IIT Kanpur. Rahul Singh and Martin James were my students. So both of them are now postdocs. Rahul is sitting somewhere there. He's at OIST in Marco Rosti's group. And Martin is in University of Genoa with Agnesa Seminara. And what I'm going to talk about are sort of summarized in these papers, but mainly I'll focus on the first of these. All right, so what does it mean to be turbulent? I should keep an eye on the clock. So what it essentially means, I mean, to some of us, and Srini sort of went over this at length in his talk yesterday, but for the moment, what I will ask is, firstly, is there has to be a certain universality in scale invariance, minus 5/3, have a little intermittence correction. I really don't care right now, but essentially all high Reynolds number turbulent flows in a wind tunnel, in a washing machine, in your simulations should have an inertial range where you see a power law, and that power law, Kolmogorov tells us, is minus 5/3. And secondly, that these flows should be intermittent, which is code word to say that if you measure gradients, if you measure velocity increments, etc., they should end up with fat tails, which are far from Gaussian. So early work, and this is studies first by in 2015 by Bratinov, Yenke, and Frey, and this paper, of course, is the one that I keep going back to, suggested that these bacterial suspensions, if you sort of take this too as litmus test for being turbulent, doesn't quite satisfy. Why? That's because when you start measuring the energy spectrum, depending on your level of activity, which means how much light you're shining on your bacterial suspension, how much food you're giving to it, etc., seems to show up scaling laws. All right, there's a scale invariance, but these are for two different levels of activity, and you find very different scaling forms for this. Similarly, this is from the Julia Yeoman and company, their work where they sort of looked at the analog of these objects, and they find their simulations and their experiments. Yeah. I'll show more of this as we go along. What they find is that there's a complete absence of these sort of factors. So just to summarize the principal result before I go through it, what we show now is that there is an approximate scale invariance that emerges when you go beyond a critical activity, whether that's experimentally realizable or not, we'll come to it in a minute, and where there is a universal scaling exponent. So in that sense, it gets much closer to classical turbulence than what has been appreciated before. So just, this is for some of you outside the field. So just for convenience, these objects are essentially what's known as the energy spectrum. That's the UKK correlator. And that's sort of assumed to scale with an exponent k to the power delta. So what we can do is, and we can go through this later without touching on the details, what one can do is one can begin with the hydrodynamic equation and then do what's known as a quasi-normal approximation. So those of you from classical turbulence know this since the 70s, 80s, starting with Crichton and others, and essentially write down a closure equation for this system. And when you do that, you end up sort of defining the flux which goes through scales in the following way and make an ansatz that there is an effective time scale in the problem which goes as k to the power xi. So in classical turbulence, we know what xi is. It just comes from, let's say, Kolmogorov's laws, where you can sort of look at this time scale. And that sort of gives you a nice relation between the energy flux and the energy spectrum, which you can then use and incorporate in your quasi-normal model for this system. So what do you get out of this once you've made these sort of assumptions and framework? What you end up getting is that, and I'll define what low is, that for activity which is low, where you assume that the effective time scale is constant. So if you remember the Bratunov picture, you had an energy spectrum which went like this. So the large scales were hardly energetic. And what you can then sort of assume that with non-energetic large scales, you get an effective time scale which is constant, xi equal to 0. You plug it into your closure model, and then you get an explicit expression for the energy spectrum. And that explicit expression also buys you, without much trouble, the scaling exponent delta, which is certainly alpha dependent. It's not like your minus 5/3, which, at the level of theory is not a Reynolds dependent object. So how valid are these assumptions that go into this picture? So this is again from Bratunov's work, where they actually measured this effective time scale through a combination of the flux and the energy spectrum, which is how one can measure tau effective. And indeed, you find the scales that we are interested in, that this is sort of flat. So the bottom line is that at low activity, and I'll come to what low is, that you end up, although you have scale invariance, but you end up with an exponent which is not universal, but which is activity dependent. So the question is, how low is low? So there is an easy way to sort of, bind ourselves. And one can ask that, if you, look at this exponent delta, you'd see that as the system becomes more and more active, delta starts to get close to 0. So your spectrum is sort of tending to rise, and you can sort of put 0 here and take an alpha c here, and you get the number when that happens. So when your spectrum is now more or less, your large scales or small scales are equally energetic and can drive the system, then this assumption essentially breaks down. The effect, I'll show you sort of results from our work. And essentially, you cannot have this assumption anymore. By the way, so theoretically, one finds that this alpha c is around -5. I'll give you a sense of numbers, what that means in a real bacterial system, what sort of speeds that we are talking about. So when you plug all of that in, so now you end up, you say that when you're active beyond this critical activity, then you sort of construct in the usual turbulence way a time scale in the problem. So you sort of make a combination of a local eddy turnover time, if you will, and a 1/k scaling. And then you come up with an effective time scale, which has the following form. And then you go back to your numerics and sort of check whether all of this is self-consistent. So this is from our numerics, where we find that this effective tau effective that we sort of defined in a sort of semi-rigorous way indeed turns out, at least to authors of this work, turns out to be quite consistent with k-7/8. It's not perfect scaling, but since this was what we were after, this seems to be a reasonable sort of approximation to a k-7/8 scaling. And then you sort of put all that back in the machinery of these closure-like arguments, and then you eventually end up that for activity beyond the critical activity, which again, theoretically, we predict to be -5, there is an activity-independent scaling, the emergence of universality, something which is of the form k-3/2. People doing MAG are not completely unsympathetic to something which has a k-3/2 scaling form, or something that Luca and Michael, etc., found for some other disordered systems in the Burgers problem. All right, so how does it square up with data? So these are from our sort of simulations that we did, where we actually measured the scaling exponent as a function of alpha, and you see there's this sharp drop. So this sort of fits perfectly with both the Bratunov prediction for in this range and our sort of calculation from closures. And then you see beyond this critical activity, you end up something which sticks at -3 hours. So at this point, I'll show you further evidence from other people's groups. At this point, I should emphasize that I'm not, completely sold to the 3 hours idea. What I want you to take back is that there is an emergence of a universal form, which was something that, these systems seemed not to display. All right. So do we have evidence from elsewhere showing this? So these are snapshots of, some other papers by other groups in other active systems as well. And then if you, so for example, in the Voids group, we sort of digitize the data in some sense and sort of realize that, people who've done numerics know it's hard to tell from -5/3 to -3 halves, right? And so -3 halves is just as good a fit as -5/3 is. These are sort of work on epithelial tissue, on different other active matter systems, which all show that as you become more and more active, you seem to collapse to this sort of universal scaling form, which our closure or theory sort of tries to generate. So what are the consequences? And I won't really speak about this, but we can, if there are people interested, we can discuss this over lunch. So one of the consequences of this critical activity is that a form of anomalous diffusion arises beyond alpha C. So essentially things are simple diffusive. The only sort of one of the rare experiments preceding our work which sort of showed that that may not be the case was from Gil Ariel's group. But what we now find is that as you go from mildly active and cross this critical activity threshold, just remind me, I should tell you what that translates to in numbers as far as bacterial suspensions are concerned. It sort of flips from simple diffusive behavior to super diffusion, anomalous diffusion. There's there's further experimental confirmation more recently from the group in IIT Kanpur, which also sort of measured this in their, I think they use subtilis bacterium systems to actually find that this 4/3 is probably robust. The second consequence, and this sort of nicely gets me into the world of high Reynolds number flows in the remaining 15 minutes or so that I have, is the fact that the second consequence of this is that, beyond the critical activity, if you're measuring the Lyapunov exponent, you want to know how chaotic your flow is. In high Reynolds number turbulence, we know, mean field theory, multifractal theory, with corrections that the Lyapunov exponent grows somewhat unbounded with Reynolds number, right? Square root Reynolds, whatever, with corrections. What we find here is that in these systems, the Lyapunov exponent, and you have to really look at this plot, I'm sorry, sort of grows as you make the systems more active, then you hit the critical activity, and then it stops growing. So it becomes sort of maximally chaotic at alpha C and stays there. This, of course, was something that we used some recent tools that we developed for many body systems, how to measure leading Lyapunov exponents. So that's the sort of apparatus that we used. So this sort of begs the question that is active turbulence really like classical turbulence? The universality beyond alpha C seems to suggest, but there are other indicators which aren't. And this sort of takes me now to the world of classical turbulence, where we sort of ask this question in more sort of comfortable territory for many of us. Okay. So we now move from the world of low Reynolds number flows, where the take-home message for this talk was this issue of universality, and move to the world of fully developed turbulence. That's a sort of maybe a one-page summary of everything that's been said in the last day and a half. It's an example of a non-equilibrium stat-mech system. And the telltale signatures, and this is a personal bias, of course, is that it's chaotic, irreversible, intermittent, with multiple length and time scales. So this, in some ways, sort of summarizes the kind of questions that Karthik raised, that sort of Srini laid out, is that, how does one sort of try and bind ourselves together in this sort of jigsaw puzzle? So just to sort of go through this in a minute or so, because that will be quite useful, is that we sort of learned about the Kolmogorov theory, and most of us know about it. And essentially, one is interested, for example, if I look at these inertial range of scales, then one is always asking the question, what happens to this guy, right? This sort of gives rise to those zeta p moments that Srini and Karthik was discussing yesterday. And so the Kolmogorov picture essentially becomes one of a non-intermittent space-filling picture, where everything cascades downwards, and the Kolmogorov sort of, within quotes, the mean field picture gives you the Hölder exponent h1/3, and these exponents p/3. However, and this is data from Rahul and Ruba many years ago that I've sort of replotted. However, when you actually measure these exponents, you end up seeing that the p/3 is certainly not really valid. So one sort of goes back to the Frisch-Parisi multifactorial model, and this is not a tutorial, but just for the sake of completeness. And then you break this sort of space-filling picture with a not space-filling picture, and that gives you a handle. It's not really a microscopic theory, but that gives you a handle to actually understand where this departure from the Kolmogorov mean field ideas happen. So one point I'd like to mention, and this is in relation to a remark that Karthik made, that essentially intermittency does matter. It's not a sort of fundamental question, if you will, or an esoteric question for theorists. So here's, two from my own paper, so I apologize to others who've also made this point. But if you're looking at real world problems, so this is from a work some years ago with Jeremy and Uwe and Holger, where one sort of found that if you're trying to understand how aggregates grow in a warm cloud, and you're measuring the turbulent collision kernel, then you see that intermittency corrections, mu, etc., do matter. And this is from a more recent work with Pratik, who's a postdoc and sitting somewhere there, where Pratik sort of examined how ice crystals orient in a cirrus cloud, if you like, and the orientation dynamics, which really play a key role, for example, in the energy content, etc., how much radiation you reflect, how much you allow in. So in all of this, intermittency matters. So that's sort of, that's a point that I wanted to make to the audience. Okay, back to multifactorial. So I'll just sort of essentially follow the Sreenivasan nuclear physics B paper, which is a fantastic sort of prescription on how to calculate all of this. And then I'll show you what we felt was kind of surprising. All right. So you've gone through these exponents in the earlier talks. I will not again define them, but how do you compute these exponents at a practical level? So essentially you get time or space series of epsilon. You sort of divide this sort of series into little boxes of different sizes, and you end up effectively calculating the partition function from where you get the so-called generalized dimension. And once you do that, as Srini mentioned in his talk, you end up getting the so-called singularity spectrum, which in the Kolmogorov world sort of gives you dq spatial dimension. I'm thinking of three-dimensional turbulence equal to 3, and alpha 1, f alpha equal to d equal to 3 again. All right, so this is sort of, well known in the business, and people have looked at it for a long time. So what we did was we sort of looked at this is actually from our simulation, where I show you the Johns Hopkins database as well. And then in a real flow, so this is the epsilon or the dissipation field, a slice of it. We perform the same game, and then not surprisingly, we end up with forms that people have known for 20, maybe 30 years now, right? So the question that we are, so the interesting thing about, maybe I'll just skip the comments and get to the calculations, is the question that we asked was sort of a naive one, but somehow prompted also by the work of Berenger and John Gibbon more recently, where they sort of connect the multifractal ideas to the tools that analysts use, is to ask the following question, that since everything varies, could we find a local measure of the singularity spectrum? What people do is calculate the global measure. So you take your full field and you play the game. But suppose there was a way to calculate f alphas as a function of x, what's the variation I'm likely to see? And from there, can I think about the variance of these exponents and how they change in time, etc.? That's the sort of project that one's after. So essentially, one can actually sort of look at a toy problem, which was introduced by Verma and others many years ago, the so-called curdling or the multiplicative cascade model, where we can construct various sort of signals by hand, which are monofractal, which are multifractal, which are largely monofractal with a little bit of multifractal nature to it. And then, you follow the prescription that we just discussed, and you get, except when things are really monofractal, even when things are mixed, you get this broad spectrum. And sort of
broken line is local.
This one?
No, broken line.
This one?
No.
Sorry.
Okay, mixed. What does it mean mixed?
Oh, so from the signal, largely it's monofractal. By hand, we sort of tuned it to be 5%, let's say. So this is the standard curdling picture. But I just wanted to use this to emphasize that you can get globally multifractal, even when you have. All right. So what we are after, essentially, and none of this is really answered, but what we are after is, can we get H as a function of X? Can we get dq, etc., alpha as a function of X? And could there be spatial variations? All right. So the question that one is asking is, are these flows uniformly multifractal or not? So again, this sort of, Sugan and Ritwik, so this is a work in progress. So Sugan was a student of mine who graduated a week ago. He's now at Johns Hopkins in the group of Gregory Ink. Ritwik is a current PhD student who's just about starting. So the early work is sort of reported in this archive. All right, so very quickly, what we do is we take, for example, the Johns Hopkins database. We sort of looked at a wide range of Reynolds number, and we tile our flow. So essentially, we construct these little tiles, and within each of these tiles, that will be our world, and we'll construct the generalized dimensions, the singularity spectrum, and then we'll see what happens when I go from tile to tile. Yeah, Prasad. There's no time averaging yet. So we are looking, you'll see at the conclusions why we run something with a big time series, just to see how long, how persistent that local variation is. All right. So one can sort of calculate the partition function, if you like, in these different tiles, and then essentially measure the singularity spectrum from there. As a quick remark, for example, what happens if you look at the correlation dimension D2 in the styling approach? So now this is D2 of X, and you see this sort of widely varying behavior from the 2.7-ish that we are kind of familiar with, all the way up to 3. So here's a zoomed in pattern. And so essentially what we see are these sort of, again, frozen in time, Prasad, these sort of pockets of coherent D2, right? And then if you go and do the full sort of spectral analysis, then you find, so these are for different tiles, randomly chosen for illustration. What you find is that depending on where you are, you get either things which are very sharp or things which are spread out, right? So there is variation between these two things. And as we shall see, even if we don't have time now, but over lunch, that this is kind of consistent with some sort of a K62 picture. All right. So how do I quantify this variation? So we use the simplest approach. We should be careful about sort of taking the standard deviation of these plots. That's because this is not really a PDF, but it's a spectrum of exponents. But let's say we look at the standard deviation of alpha of X, which is now spatially varying. And then you see that this object phi, yellow would be monofractal. So there is nothing. This is one, Kolmogorov. And red would be things when things have a very wide spread. And you see these patches of yellow, so largely monofractal in this sort of prescription, if you like. This again is from the Johns Hopkins sort of database. This is the full field, the 8192 cube.
When you compute statistics, you just take one snapshot? Or...
Yeah, so yeah, that's what's exactly what Prasad was saying. So this is not average, and I'll tell you at the end why. Yeah. Okay, and so you end up seeing this sort of variation in space. All right, you can actually measure within these sort of boxes the variational multifractality, and this is why I said maybe we can discuss this going forward, and you see this sort of log behavior, which, and this is something that we are trying to work out, so this is sort of, from the last couple of days or so, where this sort of log behavior might well connect to the K62, and, for example, this paper by Boffetta, Mazzina, and Volpiani, where you look at the width of the spectrum from K62, and you see somewhat similar. So we are trying to make this sort of more formal. All right. So just to end, so for the moment, I'm just sort of making a slightly provocative. This is not to be taken very seriously, of course, but it seems, and this again is a snapshot of the epsilon and the phi fields, it seems that if such a prescription is valid, with a capital IF, then it seems that most regions of the flow can be treated as Kolmogorov. And the islands of multifractality are sort of coherent structures, far and, isolated, dispersed. We need to now look at the time evolution of this, how long they persist, and what's the correlation with this. Okay, so just to conclude, and then I'll sort of, in the spirit of, Sreeni's talk, I'll just make a couple of observations, because there's a discussion session on Friday, just to sort of, provoke all of us. So what I showed was that there is an active classical turbulence correspondence, which is quite interesting. So and the fact that, closure goes through, and then, when we sort of look at in real 3D high Reynolds number turbulence, we find this sort of local variations in multifractality, which sort of begs the question, are there sort of limited patches? And this is something that we are trying to understand from some of John's work in the last couple of years, John Gibbons. Are there these sort of isolated H less than 1/3 patches, which we might be able to detect? So in the last sort of minute that I have, I'll just make 3 additional remarks. So one is about the talk that I did not give. This was what I was planning to talk about, but Sreeni brought this up, so I thought I'll flash it nevertheless. One is there seems to be stuff that can still be done with closure models, with ADQNM. So I just wanted to, so this was actually what I wanted to talk in this meeting, because this is really more field theory, but we haven't really calculated finished the calculations. So this is with Sugan, Dario, Giorgio. So what we've sort of looked at the D-dimensional closure model for MHD, and this is sort of the first set of plots that we have, where we seem to, and this is in the spirit of the Kuznetsov model, where you make these similar plots in the compressibility phase. We seem to sort of predict that there is an upper and lower critical dimension between which dynamo action happens. That's all closure, beyond which you find no dynamo. And this is where I don't see Spenta. It's a question that Spenta had asked about the issue of Kolmogorov constant, where again, closures sort of tell you a little bit about what happens to the Kolmogorov constant, how it blows up at D4/3. The other, which I find interesting, fascinating, I mean, Luca has worked on it a lot as well, is the issue of, can we gain a little bit more on looking at non-intermittent turbulence? So this plot of the velocity gradients, or the vorticity, that they had from the paper, which is referred somewhere here, was to show that there is a way in which you can surgically tune the triadic interactions and end up getting non-intermittent turbulence. And so is there, and we've sort of also worked on this, and sort of begins a bit with the ideas of Lvov, Pomyalov, and Prokacia, where is there hope in sort of looking at some questions, because these seem to be much closer to the world of statistical mechanics as we understand, because you might be able to go to systems which are fluxless, but still sort of Kolmogorov in some sense, turbulent in some sense. And finally, the issue of dissipative weak solutions came up. This is really a mathematician's world, but just to argue that there are recent sort of work, in a few groups, which have looked at this question from the point of view of numerics of the Euler equation. So Marc-Étienne Brachet talked about these sort of thermalization and finite dimensional systems, which is natural when you're trying to solve the Euler equation on a computer, but there is a possibility, and this is just a snapshot. So this is the system that Mark was talking about where things thermalize. But if there are several sort of approaches that one is doing, including one which I borrowed from York's paper some years ago, where you can probably end up killing thermalization, but still finding dissipated solutions. Then there's also the issue of Mikado flows that Luca, Takeshi, Uriel have been involved in. So these are sort of synthetic flows that I think it might be interesting to go back to. Okay, so I will stop here and take questions. Thank you.
Time for questions and comments.
In this active turbulence, you had the super diffusion, but also you have on the other hand the spectrum, which k minus 3/2. Can you relate one scaling to this your super diffusion?
Yeah, where alpha, yes. So in this case, the activity scale at which the emergence of universality, that's pegged in where the super diffusion happens. That is really the transition.
The exponents of super diffusion.
Oh, no, that we could relate with the Levy statistic. So you can look at individual trajectories, work out the Levy statistics. So look at the waiting time distributions, and you know that that's bootstrapped with the mean square displacement. What I didn't get to tell you a little is then there are ways to bootstrap yourself. The other is to look at the first passage distribution, which is another way to connect these ideas. And lastly, the reason we think there is a super diffusive behavior is, and I didn't show it, of course, is that there is an emergent structure in the flow called streaks, or that we sort of call streaks. It's a bit, it looks, I can show you later, but it looks a bit like the laning phenomena that you see in a lot of soft matter systems. So you have streamlines going one way, and that sort of facilitates it. And so now there are some experiments whose data we are sort of re-looking to see if they exist.
I have a great sympathy for the view that you proposed, colmography and C and regions of multifractality. Although it should be said that even though those regions of multifractality, as you call them, occupy very little space in some sense, they could be very important in establishing even low-order structures. For example, some singular-like stagnation point or a foci or something like that may create a first-order effect on low-order structures as well. So I think even though the picture kinematically probably is correct, as you said it, dynamically it may probably not be correct. I don't know. So that's just a comment.
I agree with that
you.
sentiment,
Yeah.
just to make it clear
Yeah.
that they matter, which is why we use the curdling model that you guys had used as well, just to establish this
could
idea.
be. But in the last slide you have is the one, yeah, no, go next.
I'm heading
Where
the
you
right way.
showed some weak solutions.
This, yeah.
What is that? What are you showing there?
Okay.
I'm interested to know what you have.
What I have. So briefly the following. So when people start to play with the Euler equations, do simulations, they're finite dimensional and Galerkin truncated. I mean, Mark Etienne went through this yesterday, and they thermalize. So the way they thermalize is essentially through these oscillations, something that we worked on many years ago with Sergei Nazarenko and Uriel Frisch and Takeshi. What we now show, so in the Burgers, this is the Burgers work where there's a reasonable physicist proof that, but it's an academic problem, that you can actually kill thermalization and you can get the weak solution of the Burgers equation numerically, not fast-Legendre, not the other ways that we know. That's because we want to take it to the Euler problem, right? Where you don't have these tools. In the Euler, so these are sort of preliminary work. So this is just a simple flow which has, vortex sheet, vortex line, etc. And because when you evolve them, because of truncation, the same thing that Mark was telling you, you have these oscillations which eventually pervade all space. So if it's 3D Euler, you get a k-squared spectrum at the end of it all. So what we've done is sort of in this problem, we've sort of used an idea that Jorg had used several years ago, where one can split up the local and non-local interactions in the Euler problem and reconstruct the field to get rid of these oscillations, which will lead to thermalization. And you end up getting a dissipative Euler solution numerically. The problem is what we do not know, and this is really at the bitter end of this paper by Sugan, where he sort of studied the thermalization problem in Euler. So it's just as an appendix because more work is needed. Unlike the Burgers, where we have a theoretical way to understand the rate of energy dissipation. So I can choose how to numerically dissipate by knowing what I need to match to. In the Euler, we do not have it. Short of taking the largest simulation with the highest Reynolds number and then hope the nu going to zero. At some point, there is no discontinuity in that graph and to measure. So that's something that we are still sort of wrapping our heads around, that we are sure now that in Euler simulations, we can get dissipative solutions. I should also highlight this work by Fein Munchen, from last year. But we do not know if it is the dissipative solution. It certainly picks out from the family of weak solutions a solution which is dissipative. The next step that we are trying to do is to wed it to the Navier-Stokes side.
Physically, pictorially, a weak solution of the Euler equation.
I'll show you over lunch.
Okay.
So,
tangential discontinuity.
Sorry?
Tangential discontinuity is a weak solution of Euler.
One possible weak solution. But sorry.
I had a very nice talk. I had a comment about this idea to measure local scaling exponents.
Yes.
Because I've always been a bit skeptical.
I know.
As you know. I mean, the story goes back to early 90s when the French people, Alain Arnaudot, Uriel Frisch published a Nature
Yeah,
paper.
I sort of referred to it somewhere in the top.
Where they claim to have measured the D of H, and it, like all the other Nature papers, it turned out to be wrong.
I know
right?
the story, yes.
So how do you know that indeed you are not confusing with spurious multifractality? I mean, if you apply wavelet analysis to a monofractal signal, you measure a spurious multifractality.
Yes.
This is known.
Yes.
So how can you be confident that your local measurement of a scaling exponent is not a spurious effect?
So absolutely valid. I mean, we've sort of slept on this quite a bit. So the only thing that we know, unlike the wavelet problem, Luca, that you mentioned, which, again, sorry, in France, they had also been doing this with the group there, Marifage, etc. Here, we do not do anything to our dissipation field first, right? So all we need to worry about, in a sense, is do I have enough resolution within a tile to get the scaling exponent? So what we did was we looked at various sort of like Pearson coefficient, etc., to see the level of confidence, which is sort of worked out in that archive preprint, that we can say that within this confidence, this spread is valid.
Try to apply to a monofractal field.
We did. So the toy model that I began, sorry, this was a sort of patchy talk, so I apologize to the audience. You see a delta. So we use the multiplicative cascade model. You've also worked on this in the past. So we use that curdling model, and right now Ritik is sort of working more aspects of that curdling model to actually construct synthetic turbulence, where you can put this by hand.
So this is regarding this active turbulence question. So if you just start with the equation that you had written down, do you understand how the transition to turbulence happens, in those equations, like when you kind of, if you have some non-turbulent flow beyond a critical activity, how does it have some boundary layer kind of picture?
No, so this is sort of boundary layers are, so this is still in the world of homogeneous isotropic bacteria. So what we do know, what I can say with some certainty, in case my closure that I was able to write down, where I ignore certain cumulants, the standard game that one plays, and then you sort of check it with numerics of these correlators to see if you can throw them out. The rest of it follows absolutely. with just the ansatz of what that effective time scale is. So you do see that alpha critical from the equations. So I don't know if I'm answering your question.
I was asking whether there's a way to see the transition to turbulence. Whether in some instabilities that.
Oh, you mean instability? No, that's something that I've been discussing a little with Rama, and this sort of goes back to the question that I was answering Grisha. Is it seems that at alpha critical, there is an emergent reorganization in the flow, which I don't have here. I'm sorry, but I can show to you over lunch, where you have certain structures which develop in the flow, and that's something that a group in Israel also sort of experimentally kind of seen that structure. Now, what Rama and I have been sort of trying to understand is, can we pin that to an instability which emerges at alpha C? But instability is where I'm, yeah. But the only thing that I see is the universality, which comes from their equations.
We have one last question.
Yes, I have a simple comment and a question.
Yeah.
Your observations about locality of multifractality in essential means that multifractality is not a universal thing. It's not a local property of the whole flow, which is universal over the whole flow. It depends on, varies from place to place. And it fits the picture, simple picture we have in mind, which is that there are two components of velocity. Potential part of velocity, which is involved in energy cascade, Kolmogorov, maybe Kolmogorov or quasi-Kolmogorov scaling, at least with Kolmogorov identity. So there is Kolmogorov part, the potential part, and then there is vorticity, which is dissipative part. So my conjecture, and I want to ask you a question about that, is that there is something universal in distribution of the vorticity part, and less so about the potential part. And in particular, multifractality, which you noticed, was apparently multifractality of the potential part, differences of velocity, not the circulation. The distribution of circulation, which was analyzed today by Luca Moriconi, and which is subject of my talk later, I think it has a chance of being universal, unlike the potential part. So did you make distinction between potential part and
no? Short answer, no. But I need to understand this a little better from you, probably, just to have this discussion. Unless Luca has a comment on that, because in this room he's the one who looked at multifactor statistics. Yeah, which is also my. So I deflected it to you, Luca. Okay, so maybe we can discuss what is
really last question.
Okay, thank you. You in your slide you have this activity alpha, and as you increase alpha, initially it has at low alpha a continuum families of scaling exponents, and as you increase alpha, there's a scale invariance. Do you think that increasing the activity alpha kind of suppresses the long range interactions, and
no,
it has nothing to do with interaction range?
This is my as you see, alpha is just multiplying u, so I don't think so, but I might be wrong. I don't think so.
Okay, thank you. Second question is that okay.
Okay, so thanks again.